So Jupiter conjunct Uranus. Let's take a look at this chart. Now, there's so much that's been happening over the last couple years that are presaging this. And actually, any Jupiter conjunction with an outer planet, I mean, if we look at Jupiter Uranus, that this is only a possible conjunction in Taurus every 83 years. You know, so like that's one of the great magic things about planetary cycles, that actually 7 Jupiter cycles are very close to 1 Uranus cycle. And I have a bit of a heterodox view about Jupiter and Uranus together, is that I actually think in many ways Uranus is the higher octave of Jupiter. They amplify each other. When Jupiter is about amplification anyway and expansion, and Uranus is like this maverick feature that propels things into other worlds. And so when you think about this, that Uranus is presenting large amounts of novelty to Jupiter, unexpected, unpredictable events, and Jupiter is amplifying that. And this particular conjunction of Jupiter with Uranus in Taurus has not happened since 1941. So there's about an 83-year periodicity to it. There's been a lot of speculation about what this is about. Jupiter, of course, has been in Taurus since the middle of last year, and it will remain in Taurus until it moves into Gemini. Uranus has been in that vicinity for a while, but so therefore Jupiter and Uranus have been within 10 degrees of each other for a while, and have come within 10 degrees and kind of left that 10-degree orb and back into the 10-degree orb. But the only exact conjunction is here in this flashpoint month of April. Now, I went on record yesterday. I don't really make predictions or anything like that, but I have this sense that April of 2024 is the possibility of another timeline split, where there's an acceleration of world events that happen at that particular time period. And much of that also, as we'll see as we go through this presentation, that there's also pretty major stuff happening in April, including the eclipse and including Venus descending into the underworld and having its death by intent portal. So I think whatever the union of Jupiter and Uranus intends, it will be like March, April, May time period that we'll see really what that is. I mean, a lot of times people would think, well, gee, wouldn't Jupiter and Uranus in Taurus, so that sounds like something, you know, pleasurable. However, the last one was in 1941, and the one before that is in the vicinity of the Civil War. You know, so I mean, so there's other connotations to this that are different than some more mainstream view of the sign of Taurus. So it could be something rather different than what you might be expecting. I don't want to fully go into this. We had a whole seminar actually earlier in the year just on the Jupiter-Uranian phenomena, and that's presaging and suggesting many things that this might be about in April. But this is certainly one of the most important things for 2024. Greg is mentioning that he'll talk about this during the Preparing for 2025 council. Okay, so important event. Then we go to another Jupiter one, Jupiter entering Gemini. And Jupiter entering a sign is about every 12 years. and now it's happening during the summer, during I shouldn't say summer, I mean globally, but it's during the time period around the June solstice. So about every 12 years, Jupiter is going to go into Gemini. And the very interesting thing about this, which is actually going to be presented in some depth by Gemini Brett, is how this movement, and you can look at it, Jupiter at 0 Gemini, Venus at 2, it just happens that at that same time is when Venus and the sun are conjunct, and that's when Venus is in the underworld on the other side of the sun. But what's really important and interesting about the movement of Jupiter into Gemini is that there's this region of the sky, which is the zone of one of the two cosmic crosses, the place where the galactic edge is, where the Milky Way galactic plane and the ecliptic will intersect with each other within what the Lakota call the sacred hoop. And you'll understand how this operates, because those who know stars and their longitudes know that what is the coordinate for the Pleiades is 29 Taurus to 0 Gemini. So when Jupiter moves into Gemini, it's just crossing the Pleiades into the hoop, the hoop of creation, which runs from the Pleiades to about 23 Cancer by longitude, which is over in the constellation of the Twins. So anytime there's a planet that moves through that zone, then it's going through the area of the sky, which is the zone of cosmic creation, we could say, or the galactic edge, where in many esoteric and also Aboriginal traditions is where the souls enter into incarnation. The other thing about that that's useful to remember is that when you look at the sky, the Roman numeral 2, which represents, I mean, it looks like a Roman numeral 2, that represents the constellation of the Twins, stands right above where that crisscross, where the galactic plane and the plane of the solar system intersect within the circle. So when Venus and Jupiter and the sun, and we're putting our focus here on Jupiter, when it reaches 0 Cancer, that is the point of the exact galactic alignment, which is associated with the galactic edge, one of the two cosmic crosses. And it's the cosmic crosses that I did mention that a little bit yesterday, which is the larger stellar framework to allow us to know where we are in the much larger span of history or be able to not beyond a year, beyond one age. But how do we tell like what the whole 26,000 year cycle and beyond would be? It's these cosmic crosses. So the fact that Jupiter is the symbol of amplification, expansion, enthusiasm, activation, with the sun and Venus in the same zone, right there with the Pleiades and having being in the hoop of creation, it's expanding our capacity, I believe, to receive input from outside the galaxy coming in, which is what the galactic edge represents. So every time, actually, our school will have we'll have our own designated seminar that we'll have probably coming up in April sometime, May, probably early May, which will be on the ingress of Jupiter into a new sign. And as I'm noticing here, that actually Jupiter will reach its furthest advance in 2024 will be 21 Gemini. So it doesn't quite reach the 0 Cancer point which is the place of the cosmic cross. So that happens in 2025, which is why that is a main feature of Gemini breast presentation. Okay, still sticking with Jupiter, 2 times in 2024, Jupiter will be squaring Saturn. August 19th, 2024, and December 24th, 2024. And we can maybe take a look at those charts. August 19th, 2024. Now, at that particular time period, Venus is no longer in the underworld. It will have come up as an evening star. But also during that, you can see the degrees of the Saturn Jupiter square, 17 Pisces, 17 Gemini. And you'll also notice here that Jupiter and Mars are very close. And so Jupiter and Mars are in the hoop. Mars is in the hoop. It would have passed over the Pleiades on its beeline to zero Cancer on the cosmic cross. And then so the Saturn-Jupiter alignments, I've always found to be quite interesting. Even the squares can be actually quite, certainly the oppositions and the conjunctions can be really useful for having an alignment between kind of balancing out the different excesses that can happen with each one. You know, like too much Saturn is too much limitation, too much Jupiter is too much expansion. Now, there is certainly a tension with a square, but it's as Rajar puts it, the square is like called crisis in action. So events take place and then we respond to those events. But how would you respond to them with Jupiter and Saturn like this? There's an analogy that I have been using for many years regarding Jupiter and Saturn. Since they both have to do with middle world issues, meaning the real world, you know, not celestial, not underworld, things that have to do with objective reality. The square aspect, I believe it's like a testing ground relative to your own engagement with what could be called right livelihood. Okay, so for example, if you're really in harmony with your right livelihood, imagine like two trains that are going down parallel tracks. And so when Jupiter and Saturn are in alignment, like a conjunction or even an opposition, which is resonant polarity, the trains are moving at the same speed. And so, and what are the two trains? Your right livelihood and what the universe needs to have done. Okay, you know, so your dharma is in alignment with what the needs are dharmically of the planet or the culture. In the square, you're wondering, like, is my dharma in sync with the cultural train that's going by? And so that there's a calibration that seems to be needed to be made at that time, or that's the challenge that's taking place at that point. It seems to me that the fact that Jupiter is with Mars here is that the Gemini aspect of this is probably going to be wanting more diversity and freedom than what Saturn is trying to say here, you know. So it's like, how do you balance those two in a square? I think it's very possible. And if you're able to figure out how to make the cultural train and the personal train align, then essentially what happens is you have the resources. The resources are there because putting Jupiter and Saturn together, even in a square, is offering that possibility of the resources definitely being available if you're on track with the union of those two dharmas. And I'm using the word dharma as kind of a combination of what you're born to have as your duty or responsibility, but it's also connected to what the world also needs for you to be doing and expects you to be doing. Okay, so let's look at the other one. There's another one coming up this year. Sorry, not this year, next year. So here we have the Saturn, Uranus, I'm sorry, Saturn, Jupiter square um, at the 14th degree. You know, so again, the Jupiter is still in that pretty much that same area. And I guess this one is going to just be like um, you know, the number two, I believe there'll be a third one, you know, so then we have it's a triple one, another one in 2025. So it's like a triple square between Jupiter and Saturn. And so by the time we get to the end of 2024, hopefully that it's at that point you would have figured out how to make the trains at the same speed, you know, that the decisions have been taken that allow you to be supported by objective reality, the real world, the middle world, and what it is you're choosing to do. Um, Here's a question: who does the squaring in each of the squares? Well, actually, this is two outer planets with each other. You know, when it comes to Jupiter and Saturn, one is not. Um, I see them as pretty equal. You know, and the only reason I put on the one before a little greater emphasis on Jupiter was simply because Mars was there. You know, but I think that the purpose of Jupiter and Saturn together, those being the planets that symbolize the being in this world, but beyond the personal. So one is they're both like having a relationship with each other. Now, of course, if they have a relationship with something on your own individual chart, well, then we're talking a different story. You know, then you're if you have something on your own chart that has an inner planet or an angle, then they become the doers to your chart. But their relationship with each other is, you know, kind of an equal relationship, relative to their own function. Um, one about expansion and one about learning through limitations and boundaries. So I like that. I've had a long experience in my career, my practice, of seeing what happens when Jupiter and Saturn have aspects on the chart, and they're usually people that do okay as far as the real world stuff. You know, they seem to have money in the bank, or they can have resources available. The square is though where you're making an adjustment on that, like. I, I have to figure this out to have those two trains, you know, work at the same speed. All right, uh, let's go to the next. Certainly, the Pluto Aquarian issue is yet still a huge one in 2024. And as it actually, by the time we get to 2025, there's no more uh, going back into seeing what Capricorn is about. So fully Pluto into Aquarius. And so let's look at those charts. So we have that ingress into Aquarius yet again on January 20th. And you can, you know, see what is happening at that time period. That's right around the time period, by the way, when Mars has risen from the underworld, having completed its sojourn in the underworld dimension in its cycle. So Mars is just barely creeping out of the above the eastern horizon in the morning. Um, and here and what would be round two of the ingress of, uh, of Pluto into Aquarius. And then we'll speculate on that in a moment. And then here's the next one, the final one. Um, and then there'll be, I forget how many years at the moment. It's like one of the longer time periods of Pluto in Aquarius. I forgot to get that chart out here. I did a seminar on that recently. Thank you, Greg. 2044 is when Pluto will be in Aquarius until 2044. And that's well after the end of the time frame that we see as being the Great Turning. The Great Turning, as I was mentioning yesterday, is from 1962 to 2034. And now, I could spend a huge amount of time in this conversation with you all today about Pluto and Aquarius. And in the view I would have of Pluto in a sign is that it is revealing or pointing out where the shadow of that particular sign would be, where that particular mystery school would be. So like Pluto in Sagittarius would be like the dark night of the soul relative to Sagittarius. In Capricorn, Pluto in going through Capricorn, and particularly with that huge highlight when Jupiter and Saturn were there also. These are such symbols of global significance that we cannot entirely know what they intend until after the time frame. And we can look back on, say, the Pluto and Leo generation, what was that about? Or the Pluto and Virgo generation, what was that about? Certainly the inquiry into what is the shadow of Aquarius is ongoing. But now I've recently gotten these new clues that I'm going to be continuing to look at, which is the fact that maybe in the modern rendition of the streams of water coming out of the water bearer, yes, that's the constellation, not the sign, but there was a revision of the constellation when the sign-based zodiac was invented by the late Babylonians and early Greeks, that took some of the imagery of the water bearer constellation and integrated it into the sign. But there's actually a lot of difference between the sign of Aquarius and the constellation of the water bearer. Yet still there is some evocative imagery that could be there. And I think maybe these days, rather than the attribution of the sign of Aquarius to be just about technology, that actually it may be the streams of plasma coming down on the planet at this time. Kind of like liquid fire, or the first what we can now say is the first state of matter, plasma, coming out of the streams. So I know that most people think of Aquarius as an air sign, that it's the mental. But the original constellation was water, universal water, So that's got changed when the sign became an air sign. So I think it's possible at this point Pluto is bringing. It's basically, if a person tries to detach too much, then Pluto and Aquarius is forcing them to have to go into the underworld, into the depths of feeling. And then on a global sense, it's like the composting of the shadow of Aquarius. And that would be the excesses of technology, AI, the most extreme version of collectivism that denies the validity of the sovereign autonomous self that has a spiritual will. It's very easy for the imagery we have of Aquarius to be hijacked by individuals like Yuval Harari, oh, free will, that's over, or there is no inner life, there is no spirit, there is no soul, and so on, which is like the depth of materialism. So if Aquarius ends up becoming materialistic, like materialistic technology or AI or what is called technosis, then Pluto is going to, in my opinion, have the the last say. It'll have something to say about it, and maybe that's what the influx of the plasma is actually all about. Now that we know that it's alive, so there'll be a continual inquiry into this, where old Capricorn is wanting to still hijack Aquarius, I guess you could say. Um, and then Aquarius will have to really find out what it is, including its shadow, and to be willing to take responsibility for that. And maybe that is the last part of the ingress back into Capricorn that will happen again later in 2024. So it's a really major theme, including the fact that the U.S. is just coming out of its Pluto return, which is saying, okay, so what do we have coming up next? Okay, keep moving me along there, Alwyn. That's great. Chiron conjunct the North Node. Well, let's just look at that chart for a moment, and then we'll start going into that eclipse in the U.S. chart. So here we have the nodal axis, and with the North Node with Chiron. And this event happening in February is kind of a precursor to the eclipse event. And in fact, maybe if it's easy enough for you to do, Alwyn, immediately flash to the eclipse, the April eclipse, total solar eclipse. But if that's easy, or, uh-oh. Okay, he's there. Great. So if that nodal was the nodal conjunction was, I think it was 16. Well, here we have now the North Node at 15, and this absolutely remarkable phenomena, 1923 Aries, Sun, Moon, Chiron 24, and then Chiron 24, 1924. Now, just to begin to open our awareness here of eclipses, you'll notice here that the Sun-Moon conjunction, the new moon, it's always a new moon for a solar eclipse, is only 4 degrees away from the North Node. They have to be really close to have a total eclipse. When the node and a syzygy, if the Sun-Moon conjunction or the Sun-Moon opposition is a good 10, 15 degrees from the nodes, then you can only have a penumbral or a partial. But here it's a pretty close one, so the eclipse itself is 4 minutes and 28 seconds, and that's even longer than the one in 2017. The longest can be over 7 minutes. But this is a relatively long one, and the reason why it's pretty long is because of the closeness of the Sun-Moon conjunction to the North Node. But it's this Chironic thing that is just really blows my mind here. The North Node, Chiron, and here we still have the North Node close to Chiron and the Sun and the Moon. So what this means is that this particular eclipse is a North Node eclipse. Now, there's a difference between a North Node eclipse and a South Node eclipse. The North Node eclipse, given that it's really, in a sense, a super new moon, and then the speculation could be, well, as planting a seed, how long does that cover? Like a new moon each month covers it for the moon, but covers it for that month. But then we have an eclipse super new moon. Is it 3 years? Is it longer? But then here we have a different ingredient, which is the Chironic connection, which is basically a future-oriented, you know, like planting a seed for the future, which would have to do with what is Chiron pointing out. And as I've described before in some other talks, that to me, Chiron is a teacher, and it's also not a wounder, but it's pointing out where the fracture points are. So, like, what is the fracture point of the Aries Mystery School, and how can we get past that? And this has much to do with how the last few thousand years has seen Aries, you know, as aggression or war from a traditional perspective. Um, I'm sorry, Dale O'Brien's presentation at our council is entirely about Chiron, really, and he believes 2025 is an even more challenging year for Chiron, pointing out where the fracture points are. But this is hopeful to me. The fact that that this is a north node eclipse, a future-oriented eclipse, amazing seeds could be planted at this point. Envisioning. So therefore, keeping this in mind, let's flash, if you can, to the US chart. Keeping in mind that 1924 Aries for Chiron. So here we have, and by the way, there's so many different possibilities with the US chart. I use the one that was rectified by Dane Ridjar, who believes that, you know, that from his perspective, this was a esoterically created time. You know, basically, in a sense, there might not have been everybody signing the Declaration of Independence at that point, but it was the one chosen to represent both the fate and the destiny of the United States of America. And I have a whole series of talks and articles that I've written on the shadow of the U.S. chart and, you know, the different cycle, particularly when it was a Pluto return. As you'll see, Pluto is 2733 Capricorn. And depending on whether you perceive a much longer uh, window of initiation, it could still be happening. I mean, particularly when it dips back into Capricorn near the end of the year. Um, However, here, what I'm most wanting to point out is the Chiron position. 20 Aries 08. And what we're showing here is the date of the exact Chiron conjunct. You see, here we have Chiron 2008 in the U.S. Chiron 2008. But there's a window of initiation that really covers all of 2024. I had suggested the U.S. Chiron return actually started last year, earlier in 2023, when Chiron had reached the 19th degree. But this is the exact point. And this occurs on the exact same date if you, of the aforementioned and what we looked at before, the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. Same day. You can certainly get a sense here of what a flashpoint April is. And there's yet to see here in this presentation how Venus fits into this also. But if you look at this chart here, Venus is at 3, Cancer, I'm sorry, no, that's U.S. So the U.S. has Venus and Jupiter in the underworld at 5 Cancer, 3 Cancer, and 13 Cancer. So yes, the U.S. has a Venus underworld position. Venus was on the other side of the sun, just coming up actually. And then we have, what was I looking for here? Oh, yes. So where Venus is 19 Aries at that point. And Venus would be right at the point where it's diving into the underworld. What I'm not I just saw, every now and then I see the little chats come up. And Shiva was, I'm not sure what she was asking there. The global turning of the ages, the great turning is 1962 to 2034. I'm not sure if that's what she was asking. But yes, so so what, this is the fifth Chiron return for the United States. And beyond the scope of our conversation here today, actually there has been some good research done by Dale and by Greg Nell, who's also one of our speakers at our council, on what happened at the different other Chiron returns on the U.S. chart. The fifth one should be pretty significant, particularly since in our system, Chiron is one of the planetary initiators that is allocated to the underworld dimension, as is Pluto. So the Pluto return followed by the Chiron return, and that is pointing out where the fracture points of the U.S. is. And then it's highlighted, obviously, by the eclipse and highlighted by the Uranus Jupiter alignment. I think you can begin to understand why I'm perceiving that there's a possibility of another major timeline split in April. Certainly on a far grander scale than the one I mentioned yesterday that happened in the summer fall of 1968. Or the one that has been suggested that happened in early 2022. Pretty big one. And so I'm reminded, actually, Gemini Brett will be discussing this issue also about that if Pluto is about composting, Chiron is about locating where the wounds are and techniques about how to heal them. Well, then basically, as Steiner said in the early 20s, sometimes death has to happen before resurrection. He even said the earth might have to die to be resurrected. So, but here we're looking at specifically about the United States, and Brett has suggested that actually the death has already happened, and now we're praying for the resurrection. And that's something that maybe the Uranian return can have something have a connection to. So it's hard to overemphasize the importance of these April timings, including that eclipse, and you can understand why, as a mystery school that loves working with not just the astrology but also land and sky, and being at sacred sites and working with the actual most important celestial phenomena that we have chosen to do an in-person gathering in April. If things go well, I will end up having experienced all four of the eclipses that have crisscrossed the United States from 2012 to 2024. 2012, 2017, 2023, 2024. And I have no idea whether anything like that has ever happened in any time recently in history, that one small area of the planet, one specific area of the planet, would have four eclipse tracks going over it in the space of 13 years. And the one in 2012 actually was also Jupiter in Taurus, interestingly. So it's like the four are framed by Jupiter in Taurus, actually. Okay. What do we have next? So we can just take a peek here at the other eclipses that are happening in 2024. And there is what usually happens with eclipses is that there will be an alternation between a year or so of where the solar eclipses are the greatest emphasis, And then there'll be a year where the lunar eclipses are the greatest emphasis. The year time frame, it doesn't always correspond with the calendric year. But here, this as we go into 2024, we're in a time period where the solar eclipses take precedence, where we have the one we just looked at, the April 8th, and the handout here will also shows the pathway of where it's going across, you know, pointing out there, right? Um, and there's a tremendous website if you want to get the most exact information about where the track of the eclipse is and what the information is about how long it lasts in any given spot, what time it happens, when it begins, when it ends. It's the website called Time and Date. What an incredible resource that website is. And here, yes, Carway has put it up there, timeanddate.com. Very useful, and I recommend that any of you that like to follow the the phenomena from the astronomy end of it, that one is just tremendous. Even things like rising and setting of every planet, the magnitude. I mean, it's got so much, so much. But then you can see here that the lunar eclipse, March 24th, is minimal. It's actually it's less than, it's only a penumbral, and meaning that you can barely get any shading of it at all. And then the one on September 17th is even less. It's actually a partial, but it almost like 0.008 amount of the moon is covered. And that is, you can see where that is happening there. Of course, with lunar eclipses, you'll have half the Earth in sunlight and half not. So it's very different than a solar eclipse that has a very narrow track. There is also an annular total solar eclipse. I personally think an annular solar eclipse is every bit as important as far as the track as is a total solar eclipse. I think they have been not given they've been given less notoriety than total eclipses, but I think they're super important. And here we have one on October 2nd. We can look at that chart in a moment, but you can see that it's not over North America or the Northern Hemisphere. It's in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's south. There it's like in the southern part of South America and Antarctica and that area. So that would be interesting to see how Antarctica fits in, or that southern part of South America fits into what is happening next year. Certainly that depending on what you follow as far as your research, there sure is a lot of stuff coming out recently about Antarctica and what in the world are they doing down there? I think this is maybe pointing a finger of research for let's look more at what's happening in Antarctica, in that area, the furthest extreme part of South America. Why don't we just look at that October 2nd chart? 10 Libra. And the reason why we have a pretty strong eclipse is you can see there the only 4 degrees separate from the degree of the new moon with the south node. So this is a south node eclipse. And while every eclipse includes elements and aspects of the shadow, it's a south node eclipse that is even more connected to what happened before. And so this is like the opposite of the one in April. And so the emphasis here is on what happened before up till now. but it's still a super new moon, so that you can still, plant seeds going forward. Uh, and this one is, of course, you can't, when you look at these eclipse charts, you can't really go by the angles per se, because this is set for Los Angeles, so keep that in mind. That you have to, if you want to know what your local condition is, you'll have to run a chart for your local area to see the angles. But here we have Mars that's still inside the hoop, has not yet reached the exit point of going through the cosmic cross that's inside the sacred hoop, the entrance point. Um, there is also, if I'm remembering correctly, that 10-degree Libra point is very close to the U.S. Saturn is 14 Libra, and there is still a closeness to the Chironic connection there. I mean, still at that time period, Chiron is 21 Aries, so it's that same zone, and then that's the sun and the moon are opposite, conjunct the U.S. Saturn. So there's still a lot of stuff going on here regarding what happens in the United States. And I'm certainly not a person who is US centric, I mean, I don't live in the United States, but still, since 4 tracks have hit the US, and for good or ill, much of what happens in the world up to this point has been uh, instigated by the U.S. I think that everything regarding the U.S. is still on the front lines here if you look at this eclipse.